soldier, and you maintain the tank, and you clean it daily, and you're quite busy, and it's a rough job. But our actual military service was almost over. We were supposed to go after half a year, 8 months of training in the tanks, back to the kibbutz for a few months, then for a final stint of a few months back to the tanks, and then say goodbye after 3.5 years to military service. That's not exactly what happened. Our unit was near Beersheba, and before Yom Kippur, we were cleaning the tanks. This was one day in which we were not drilled, in which we did not, there were no trainings, no maneuvers, but just cleaning the tanks and preparing for the holiday. And we were looking forward to that. And then suddenly, around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they call us and they say, there is an alert. And the entire brigade is going up to the Golan Heights. Later on, I learned that this was the only thing that the Israeli army did to reinforce its rather small number of soldiers on the borders. And some people claim that made all the difference in the Golan. I'm not taking the credit for it. I was in that part of the Golan where the Israeli military did not perform as gloriously as in other parts. I'll talk about that. But we made preparation to go to the Golan. This didn't mean war. There was such an alert also in Rosh Hashanah. There were occasional alerts. If you read the story of the Yom Kippur War, you know that there were a number of alerts, but nothing materialized. But this time we were sent to an air base, the nearest air base, flew to an air base, a very small air base near the Golan Heights, but not on the Golan, of course, and then were asked to absorb, if you will, tanks that were not ours, but were of the same model. Here we had something of a little bit of a shock, because, of course, we were trained to keep our tanks ready and clean and in perfect condition and with all the equipment. And we received those tanks. They were brought over to the Golan on tank carriers. And we spent the entire night actually absorbing the tanks. This was on the evening, on the night between the beginning of Yom Kippur and the day of Yom Kippur. The tanks were not in superb condition. I mentioned that because this has been mentioned many, many times. I think it's important. The Israeli army wasn't really taking super seriously in an immediate way the idea of war. The Israel between 1967 and 1973 was at the peak of its self-confidence. You cannot understand what happened in 1973 if you don't know about 1967, which was a period, was a war of more than 6 days, but it's, Moshe Dayan called it the 6-day war, like the 6 days of creation. Glorious victory. Before the war, there was even greater anxiety than described here in Bethel in 1973. There was really a sense that Israel is a very vulnerable small country, that if it's attacked, some people here are still as old as I am to remember those days of 2.5 weeks before the 6-day war. And then there was a huge sense of relief because Israel managed within 6 days to, if I'm allowed, this is Yom Kippur, I have to be very careful with my language, to beat, to really take over the Sinai, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank of Jordan, and to beat 3 Arab armies. It was also considered a success for the American weaponry, to Western weapon, French and American, a little bit British, over and against Soviet-backed Syria and Egypt. Jordan was the one country that was not Soviet-oriented. Israelis saw in that war, and I think many American Jews too, not just that Israel managed to survive or that it managed to prove its military competence, but military might, if you will. But there was almost a messianic feel. This shows that Israel was really created under the auspices of God. This really shows that we are not just the winners of the war, but the winners, if you will, of the conflict, the winners of history. I see here some people of the older generation remembering those days, those feelings. Moshe Dayan at that time was not just Minister of Defense in Israel. He was Mr. Defense. He was Lord Defense. He was Prince Defense. He was King Defense. A friend of mine who was with me in the tanks on Yom Kippur 50 years ago, and is not a right-winger at all, told me that when he reached Italy as a teenager, and the Italians didn't speak English, Israelis didn't speak English too well, and he wanted to tell people where is he from, he did something very simple. He put his hand on one of his eyes. Moshe Dayan, Israel. Everybody understood what he was talking about. There was a huge sense of trust in the government, in the country, and in the military, in spite of the fact that many people who actually served in combat units knew too well that things were on the whole okay. They were asked to prepare and train, but that this was not an infallible entity, and that not every commander and every officer was something of an invincible child, son of God, who is immortal and will save the day on every turn. In spite of that, there was a huge sense among the soldier too that we can trust our military, we can trust our commanders, and certainly we can trust to win a war if we're confronted with one. So back to the Golan Heights at 11 o'clock, we are told that there is going to be a war. At 11 o'clock, we understand that the Yom Kippur is over. I was among the minority, actually, of non-Orthodox, of non-Orthodox soldiers who was fasting. And at 11 o'clock, we all decided to stop the fast. What do you eat when you stop the fast and there is no food or kitchen around? There were abandoned vine trees around with some fruit on them, and this was the breaking of the fast around 11:30 o'clock. We also drank water. Towards 2 o'clock, we were told to prepare for an air attack. At 2 o'clock, the war started in two ways. One was indeed an air attack, but it wasn't on us. There were almost immediately, you could hear the sound of airplanes, you could hear the sound of air battles, but it wasn't directed at us. What was directed at us was a very massive artillery with artillery shells, bombs exploding all over, causing havoc and noise. At this stage in the tanks, we were not really hurt. We were hurt, but there were some injuries, but they were not kind of injuries that affected the function of our particular company. After a while, we were told to leave the area. The area is the south of the Golan, in an area that one site would become very much remembered, and it's today a pilgrimage site, a tourist site, a memorial site, Tel El Saki. We're not exactly there. We were in a place called Juhader, about just a few miles away. And we were actually asked to divide ourselves. Just a company of tanks has 11 tanks, 3 units of 3, commander and a sub-commander, deputy commander. It's 11 tanks. We also had a deputy battalion with us, so it's 12 tanks, 4 of which were sent to join another unit, and were therefore quite saved because they joined a victorious unit, if you will. We were left with 8 tanks. I'll tell you already ahead of time that 8 tanks has 32 members on it, 40% of which were killed, 10% were captured, and 50% are recognized today officially with post-traumatic stress. This was one of the unfortunate sites in the Golan. Some places the Israeli military functioned triumphantly, but there we had a problem. The problem was that those 8 tanks were sent towards Tel El Saki, 0.117 on the map. I didn't know that ahead of time. I should also add that we were not acquainted with the territory at all. The only people who more or less were acquainted were those who were affiliated with kibbutzim on the Golan, or who served, when they were still infantry soldiers, served in military agricultural settlements in the Golan. Nobody knew the territory otherwise, so we were on our way to 0.117. Our heads, the heads of the tank, particularly the commanders, but all of us, were towards the Syrian border. There was something that existed also in the Jordan Valley. It was called Gadera Ma'arechet, the system fence. There was only a fence between Syria and the Golan. And there was a road parallel to the system fence. We were looking towards Syria. What we didn't know is that a whole battalion of tanks, a few dozen tanks, managed already to cross the border. If we were looking towards Syria, we couldn't see them. We were looking toward the Syrian terrain. We actually bumped into that battalion without realizing what's happening to us. And many of us thought for a long time that this was actually like an ambush. But of course, it wasn't an ambush. The Syrians didn't have time to prepare an ambush. But they took advantage of the fact that 8 Israeli tanks were making their way into a battalion, total regiment of tanks and infantry of Syrians, unprepared, not realizing that the Syrians are already there alert. They allowed us, very smartly, to make our way towards the very end of the Syrian force before they started shooting at us. So 2 tanks, 2 commanders, their tanks managed to, if you will, escape the ambush, if you will. 1 tank managed not to enter the ambush, realizing what was going on, and retreated. Luckily, this was a tank of people who served in the Golan before they became tank soldiers, so they made their way back, if you will. And 5 tanks were caught in the middle. 2 tanks were destroyed completely. 3 tanks were harmed, but not fully destroyed. 1 commander was killed, and my commander was wounded. And there were other people wounded and tanks injured, including my tank, but still managed to make their way out of the ambush. I can go on and on giving you the details of the situation, and of course with a commander wounded in the head, we had an issue, and one of the issues was not just that he was wounded and in pain and seriously injured, as we know too well today, but that of course it couldn't function, and he also, that tank was without communication with the outside world, because the communication goes with the head cover of the commander. I had to take it from him, which was very painful to him. I had also to find my way in an area and in a reality that was very confusing and in which we found ourselves on our own and needed to join the rest of whatever was left of our company. We made our way after hours to Tel El Saki. Before that, I said that there's one thing I take enormous pride in, and that's of being a nag. In this particular case, people were confused. People were, it was just a remnant now of a company, not an actual company, functioning and ready for war. But I all the time made a point, I have here a wounded commander that is in need of care. If he stays with us, wounded as he is in his head, he doesn't have a chance. We need to abandon the tank, for example, or if we're going into battle, there's just no way that he can make it. He needs to be evacuated, and I was told at a certain point that I am a nag. But, and I take pride in that, because what happened was, and that's a miracle that would help me also survive the war, an Israeli airplane was shot by the Syrian just at that, in this area. And the pilot parachuted. He parachuted, and the Air Force made enormous effort to reach him. They always do, either with helicopters, which was, of course, out of the question in this case. So at the end, they sent a command car. It's doesn't say much. An armored car, armored vehicle, to bring the pilot out. I insisted that they stop by us, which was an issue. How do you tell them where we were? To take our commander. And this was the last time that our unit had a direct relationship or direct communication of some kind with the outside world, with the rest of the military. Incidentally, all of this would not have happened also without a very dedicated and cooperative driver of the tank, who happens to be no other than the cousin of the lady who sits here in front of me. We live in a small world, or rather, he was the husband of her cousin, who is still, he unfortunately passed away a few years ago, a very dear person. His widow is still connected to his widow. We managed to make our way to what I would call a mountain, but it wasn't a mountain. It wasn't a hill. It wasn't a mountain. It was just a fortified Israeli, what should we call it? A fortified, not exactly mountain, but bunker that was abandoned, but which a group of paratroopers was sent to occupy or use actually for reconnaissance at the beginning of the war. Tel El Saki. We managed one by one, the remnants of the tanks, the 5 tanks, to make it to Tel El Saki. There we found that the paratroopers were just standing, not knowing so much what their mission was anymore. And we were there breathing, greeting each other, hearing and evaluating the damage. And then a bombardment, a Syrian bombardment, started again. We went into the bunker, and stayed in the bunker for a while. The paratroopers were contented to stay there, but the tank people, particularly our commander, a person named Danny Levine, decided he cannot take it. He cannot stay in the bunker there for, I don't think it was even an hour, but he cannot stay in the bunker like mice trapped in a hole. He has to go out and fight or join the Israeli forces. There was an argument, there were deliberation, and he asked for volunteers, and 4 people went on this tank with him. And of course, we didn't hear from them anymore. We heard from the remnants of them, 2 were killed, 2 were captured when we reached, a while after we reached Damascus. Then the 2 other officers who were with us, one was already killed, decided that they too are going to go down the mountain. Not all the tanks were functioning at that time. So out of 5 tanks, 1 tank was already gone. And out of 4 tanks, in less than 4 crews, we went on 2 tanks down the mountain, trying to evacuate Tel el-Saki and join Israeli troops and join the fighting. Again, a huge bombardment, and my tank is hit. So we quit the tank, run to a ditch, following orders, running to a ditch on the side of the road. The first tank continues. 2 people run to tanks. 4 people, it's like a full crew, but it was 2/3 of the people on the tank at that time, are in the ditch. In the ditch too, there is bombardment, and Yor Truly is injured. Yor Truly is injured in his hand, a little bit in other places, but the most serious injury, which I didn't realize how serious it was, luckily, was in my lungs when shrapnels pierced my lung and stayed there. This caused, of course, enormous loss of energy and what you'd call, I wouldn't call it fatigue exactly, but I would call it weakness and a sense of helplessness. There were 3 people near us. 1 wasn't exactly near us, and 2 were near me. 1 saw Israeli tanks of the local unit 188 going along the system road towards Tel el-Saki. So he joined one of those tanks. 1 stayed with me. 1 was near us. During the night, the 1 person who knew the area more or less, this is Chilik, decided that he is going to quit that area, which was now surrounded by Syrians. We could hear Arabic spoken near us. And so the 2 other guys left during the night. I stayed on my own. And the first thing in the morning, I didn't sleep, I was in kind of delirium, but the first thing in the morning with sunrise, not even full sunrise, was of course Syrians surrounding me. And with their guns, those were Kalashnikovs at the time, and I remember telling myself they're going to shoot all at once, and it's going to be over very quickly and painlessly, and that's it. But then I heard myself exclaiming, "Don't shoot, I'm a pilot." Now, this would sound strange. I wasn't preparing it. I wasn't figuring it out. I was dressed in a pilot's suit. Very few people were. They decided to make an experiment and see if tank crews can wear successfully and function well with Air Force overalls. The overalls of air crews. And this was a piece of good luck. The material, first of all, was made, it was synthetic, but it was also made that if you're hit by fire, the material kind of eats itself and doesn't stick to your body. Since all of us were hit in one time or another, this was wonderful. But also, I didn't realize it then, I could become a pilot. And they were searching for a pilot. They didn't know that the pilot was evacuated. I was on my own. Again, I didn't realize all those things at that time. They also asked me, and here really you'll find that unbelievable. People, when I told the story in Damascus, I was 4 months in solitary confinement, but I joined a larger group. People said, what? How come? The Air Force people. They told me, so which is your wing, your Air Force wing, if you will, or whatever you call it? And I said, it's number 117, because this was the number that was stuck in my mind. Had I said 116, this wouldn't have worked well. 117, believe it or not, was an air wing unit of northern Israel, directed to protect Israel from Syria. The chances of that happening was not even 1 of a million. It's interesting, I could never win a lottery ticket. I can put all the numbers I want. It's not that I do that every week or every year, but I gave up, of course, after a few attempts, because it doesn't work. But in that case, I've won the lottery without realizing it. I'm mentioning that it's not actually so happy, because in that area, the Israeli military found later on 40 bodies of, I think it's close to 40, I don't know, 40 bodies of Israeli military personnel shot and killed from close range. If you were a regular soldier at that time and you were captured, you didn't have much of a chance. You had to be someone special, someone worthy, and at least for survival, being a pilot was nice. The setback was I knew nothing about the Air Force and nothing about any of its secrets, and I fell into a particularly nasty category, a pilot who would not cooperate. Well, we'll come to that. First, we're on the road to Damascus. The soldiers that captured me actually helped me sit, helped me stand, took me physically to a vehicle. I was given, I was like a sack, like a present from one vehicle to the other until they placed me in a vehicle that went to Damascus. My eyes were closed. They gave me some water. They asked me some preliminary questions. But they did not harass me. I was harassed along the way, and of course in Damascus itself quite extensively, but not by my capturing soldiers. I think is interesting. I mean, if the vehicles stopped and there was an announcement that this is actually a captive, an Israeli soldier, an Israeli pilot, the reactions were not very happy. But I was protected, and I was brought over to Damascus, and I was brought that very evening, Monday, to meet TV crews and foreign press, which was wonderful because this was in some ways a guarantee towards life. I pointed out while I was there that I'm wounded, that I'm bleeding, that I'm in need of care. And following this press conference, if you will, I was taken to the hospital. I was put to sleep. My wounds were taken care of. I don't know exactly what they did, and I would never know because the next day they brought me back to it was the ministry, or later on told the Ministry of Defense, the Syrian Ministry of Defense, and there, with my luck in life, the Ministry of Defense has already ready prison cells in its cellar. Syria was then, until 1970, there were all the time coups, and I think they decided it would be wise to already have that ready for the next coup. But since 1970, there's of course now a civil war, but since in 1970, the Assad, Hafez al-Assad took over, and the Assad family is there now for 53 years. The Israeli Air Force attacking the building, seriously, we are luckily in the cellar. Because there was a whole group by now of pilots and navigators. Those who survived the attack, the Syrians, decided that the people that need to be revenged are the prisoners. I was number one. Again, with my luck. A person called Itzik Yahav was the very last. He told me by the time they reached me, they had no energy to beat me. But all the work they have done in the hospital to mend my wounds was, of course, destroyed. And from there, they took us to a place that the pilots and navigators called, believe it or not, the closets or the wardrobe. Or there was a feeling, and that's the way I felt it. It's just an apartment or something in which they created from wood small cells and placed us there. I was, for the first week, I was naked, I was tied, and with my head to the floor. They did give us food, not enough to drink. We were all the time thirsty, but they gave us food. We were each separated, but this was the first time I had a connection with pilots and navigators throughout, because of the very, very weak divisions between the cells. But the cells were something like, speaking 1 meter on 2 meters at most. There was hardly any room there. They gave us food in pitot, which I do remember. That's what made me feel that this is just a makeshift arrangement. Well, I might have been mistaken. And we ate like that on the floor. A week there, about a week, and we were again put in a blanket, my entire body, placed in I don't know in what vehicle exactly, but in a way I could shift in the vehicle, and brought to a prison that, again, I didn't know yet its meaning, but it should have given me, had I known, huge sense of history and pride. It's the El Maze prison. Nowadays, I was told that Syria is full of prisons, and that if you're an enemy of the regime, you're not necessarily spending your time there. And I think people are losing all the historical importance of the place. El Maze was built by the Ottoman Turks, served as their major prison until World War I. Then it served the French, then it served the Syrian regimes. Later on, when I would be actually with all the simple soldiers together, I would be in the room in which Prime Minister Al-Attasi was placed. But it's not just that, it's the sense, this is where they took the Nili spies, That's an historical place. It's like being placed in, I don't know, in London in the Tower. Wouldn't you be proud? There I spent 3.5 months in that particular cellar. I won't give you details so much of my interrogations. I had nothing to say as a pilot, and I think little by little they realized it, because nobody could withstand such tortures and not share information. About 6 weeks after reaching that place, again, we were in solitary confinement, Damascus was bracing itself for the coldest winter in its history. I'm not joking. No heating, of course, for the damn prisoners. No beds or anything. 6 weeks into my imprisonment, I'm reaching with my face covered interrogators, and I sense by the questions, or by the question, that they are having doubts. By that time, I was filmed, or at least pictured. I gave my name to the prison authorities, my name and my details, and I had a prisoner card. I hope it's still there. I mean, it is an historical prison. And I had a sense that now I can share my quote-unquote secret. And they asked me, so you're a pilot? And I said, not quite. And so what are you? And I said, I'm just an ordinary tank gunner. And there was a discussion, and I heard pages go back and forth. And he told me, okay, what unit? And I told them, we're allowed to tell them what unit I belong to. Brigade 7, Battalion 82, Company D. So they asked me, were you caught prisoner with Danny Levine? And my answer, I was not there interrogated, was, so Danny Levine is here. They were informing me. I didn't know there that I would meet another person who would become a dear, dear friend, Yoav Ben David, who was the driver of the tank. But I then realized something that other people realized much, much earlier, that it wasn't just air crews who were in prison, but that there was kind of a large Israeli contingency. This became clear after, as I said, 3.5 months in El Mazeh, when it was, forgive me for stopping myself and making various exclamations, when it was extremely disadvantaged in prison to be a pilot, I was a full-fledged pilot, a stubborn pilot. When it was in my advantage to be a pilot, because they were given large rooms with beds and linen, of course I was reduced immediately to a simple soldier. And so after 4 months, they were changing the rules, they were stopping solitary confinements, and they placed me in a room in which there were already 30 Israeli prisoners, simple, regular soldiers. With those who were added, we were 37. It would be easier in meters, in a room that had 4 meters on 8 meters exactly. There was less than 1 square meter per person. It was like 10 square feet for every person. You can calculate that. There's no place, there's no way that people can relax or can exercise or can dance without, dance is out of the question, but even sleeping was an issue. We slept in a way that we slept 7 people in each contingent, we divided, since we each had one or two blankets, and this was the height of winter, so we divided them between us, 2 or 3 blankets for the floor, 3 or 4 blankets on us, for 7 people. You couldn't turn unless it was coordinated. It would be like Danny, Yossi, Yoam, Kobi, 1, 2, 3, we change, we turn around. There was no way you could turn on your own. There was no way you could decide, well, I'm not sleeping anymore, but there were no books to read, but everything had to be organized. By the time I arrived, everything was organized. A person who later on became, believe it or not, how do you call it? Those kind of engineers that organize a workplace and to make it more efficient. He was born for that. He was known as the commander, and he organized all of those 5 groups, 7 people in each group, or 8. There was a change in the group because nobody in the winter wanted to be near the door, the huge metal door, because it was freezing. Nobody wanted to be near the one and only bathroom. So the result was that there would be turns. The Syrians would bring food in much more generously, quote unquote, than when we were in solitary confinement, because they brought a whole pot, if you will, of tea, so the tea was still hot. For me, this was like my quality of life, of drinking, of food went up by a few thousand%. They gave the food in bulk to the prisoners, and there was more food, and this was divided by people. This doesn't mean that there weren't kind of, people didn't question each other at times. One person at one point took the whole contingent of olives and counted them to make sure that every person gets the 4 or 5 or 6 olives that they deserve. This brings me to another thing. Some beautiful things happened there. It was democracy. Everything was by vote. Everything was with discussion. We celebrated Friday night, including with prayers from memory. We had with us a member of something known as the rabbinical Nachal. Those Nachal soldiers who were studying in yeshiva, but of course they served longer, whether it's full military service and studies in yeshiva. And just after returning from prison, he went to receive his rabbinical ordination. He remembered not only the prayers, he remembered Rashi's commentaries. And so he became our rabbi, if you will. He would recite Parashat HaShavua with Rashi's commentaries. I don't think everyone can do that. He was an A++ student, which is, of course, annoying at times. And just when he returned, he was not only ordained, but also started his medical studies. One of those horrible overachievers. There was no lack of knowledge of Arabic, because one of the major traumas of the place was that we were together with 30 people out of the 37 were from something called the Hermon bunker. This was a huge bunker built on the Hermon in Israel, in which they placed unit of the Air Force known as technical, if you will, fighting or electronic fighting. They were trying to sabotage radio connections, and the various equipment of enemy planes. And there were lots of soldiers there who were intelligence soldiers, who were there on the Golan up there in order to listen to conversations of the enemy along the ether. As we well know, this didn't help the situation in Israel, in spite of the fact that some of them, at least one of them, did send notices that the Syrians are preparing for war. And some of the older divisions in that groups, the actual soldiers who were defending the place, just one small contingent, with the exception of one, they were all killed. And so the people who were there were either people who were maintenance people or intelligence or Air Force. They continued their old divisions. The intelligence people stayed among themselves. They were used to secrecy and they were used to socializing only with themselves. And they kept even their nickname, the strange people, Muzarim. There was enormous resourcefulness among the people. Anything the Syrians left behind was taken over and refurbished, if you will. Within a few weeks, you could play cards, you could play chess, you could play bagamon, there was singing groups. I was commissioned, or not volunteered or commissioned, to tell stories, by which I don't mean that I told fairy tales, or I was recounting books I read. One of them was The 100 Years of Solitude. Some of you have read it. So I was, it took a few hours. I was like one of those magazines that were very popular at the time, in which you don't need to read the book. You read just a summary or an abstract of the book, and then you can talk about it as if you've read it. So this was my contribution to the morale. And in some ways, it's amazing. People there with less than 1 square meter for themselves, and they managed to cooperate, and they managed to have even cultural life, and they managed to have discussions on political themes and on literary themes and on army situations. We didn't know what exactly happened during the war because we didn't follow the war. We didn't follow the news. Some people did hear the news the first day, but that didn't give us very much. But we sensed that something enormous went wrong. Later on, they spoke in Israel about המחדל. How should we translate it? מחדל, the incompetence, if you will, or the not being on top of things. We didn't call it that name. There was a slang, a military slang, and we call it fashla. I don't know if anybody was in Israel in the 1960s, 70s and knows the term. It's a term that's gone. There was even something of a slang that developed in Damascus itself. For example, one person was telling us that people shared everything with each other. And one person was saying, he drinks beer, he's very sophisticated, he drinks beer. Of course not Israeli beer. He drinks Dutch beer, only Amstel. It's more expensive, it's more sophisticated, and it's much better, and it's the best, and only Amstel. Then the term Amstel entered our vocabulary, and people used the term le'amstel. Le'amstel means to boost, to be presumptuous, to describe yourself in more than what you really are. And it became, someone tells a story, and other people say, me'amstel otanu. Just to give you one example. Another example was the mixture of Arabic and Hebrew. because we had to communicate with the guards. And so we started, the guards come, they say shu, and you say koyes. And this enters the vocabulary of the prisoners, who by the end of their stint in Damascus, even people who didn't want to study Arabic knew dozens of words in Arabic and some expression, right? Mia bidak, mia bidi, mia bidak, can I get water? Here's water, etc. Those things you learn. We had no idea when we were going to leave the place. I don't know if anybody here was in prison. There's no shame in them. But, no problem. But 8 months in prison is a very long time. One of the things I came out from prison with is those people who, he needs to spend 20 years in prison because of his, because of his traffic violation, because of him, etc. No, my dear friends, 6 months would be quite enough. But let me go to more important things. Few people remarked that they came out of prison and many things that were important before that are much less important after the war in prison. You get a different perspective on life. But I think it goes before that, the issue of memory. I'm now writing my memoirs because I discovered that even people who were in the same place with me came with very different perspective, or tried to present a different perspective, usually much more glorious or romantic than the situation really was. This is just briefly. But there's something else about being in war, in a bad spot, and prison. When we came out of prison, people were putting on a good face. So I didn't finish my course of studies at the university, but things are going very well for me. So I didn't get the kind of jobs I was expecting to get, but life is working well for me. We met 20 years after the war, 20 years after liberation, in June 1994. This was just after I just before I left for the United States, for Chapel Hill. And it was a very happy meeting because we discovered that we like each other and we care for each other. We, for the most part, didn't see each other for 20 years. People were very close to each other, shared everything with each other, trusted each other, but when liberation came, people actually each went their own way and didn't really want to spend time with their old comrades in arms. They found it a little bit too repressive, too many bad memories to share. But when we met together after 20 years, not accidentally after half a year, 2 years, 3 years, we discovered that something horrible has happened. I've been with many groups in my life, starting with elementary school, what you call here middle school, high school, military units. I was at the university. I think I was an instructor all my life. I think I can sometimes judge whether people make the most of their gifts or don't make the most of their gifts. Do people succeed even more than expected? Or people succeed less than expected? What was very clear about this group of people, that they were underachievers, that they did not manage to fulfill their dreams. There were some exceptions. Those who stayed in the military promoted them. There were 2 people who became psychologists, and they became experts of trauma, war, and captivity. But for the most part, the people who were there did not manage to make the most of their gifts. And this included, there were a few maintenance workers from the Hermon bunker, but there were people who were well educated, intelligent, non-commissioned officers. There were people there who were part of the, who were highly intelligent members of the Air Force. Almost no one of that group really built a career that did justice, that has done justice to their intelligence, ambition, and former abilities. This takes a toll at people, that kind of experience. And it was the first time realizing that, and there were some people who were unemployed, there were some people who had this issues and that issues. For the first time, the former prisoners decided to get together. It was just the beginning, and form a group that would make demands to the Israeli government, mostly that those who suffer from post-traumatic stress should be treated. This sounds today so elementary. So, a matter of fact, a number of the people who were there are involved in such groups that offer help of kinds to post-traumatic sense. One of my friends became a healer, does psychotherapy through seafaring, through sailing on boats. Another person that's related to the group is an expert on rehabilitating people through horses. Some people do it through art. There's a whole now in Israel, more than anywhere else, I think, in relative terms, a whole expertise and understanding of the importance of what is post-traumatic stress and why society owes post-traumatic victims treatment and compassion. I will end with that, and thank you again for listening, those who did, and offer my compassion to those who did not, and to offer my compassion to those who did.